You're listening to the Emmanuel Church Podcast, a ministry of the Emmanuel Church of Winterville, North Carolina. On the show, you will hear discussions from our pastors about the scriptures, the God that they reveal, and a multitude of other topics designed to encourage and challenge our Emmanuel Church family and all Christian audiences. It is our passion and prayer that the gospel of Jesus Christ be magnified in all the ministries of Emmanuel Church. For more information about Emmanuel or this show, please visit us on the web at emmanuelchurch.online. Thank you for listening and welcome to the Emmanuel Church Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's show. I'm Pastor Matt, and joining me again in the studio, as usual, is Pastor Blake Coghill. Say hello, Blake.
Hello, everyone.
We are excited about today's episode for several reasons, but especially because this is our first official episode as an actual legitimate podcast. So that's pretty exciting. We were able to get all of the old episodes. I think there were 6 in total, and we uploaded them to a podcast platform. So for those of you out there that have no clue what that is, just ignore that. Don't worry. But for those of you that are podcasters, which we have several that have already talked to us about it and are excited, we're available now on any podcasting platform, all the major ones, Apple, Google, Spotify, iHeartRadio, etc., all those different platforms. So if you just search for us, the Emmanuel Church Podcast, and you should be able to find us. We keep show notes and all types of different stuff like that from now on, and so we're excited. This is kind of a cool day for us. Mm-hmm. So we're hoping to keep the show going and encouraging. And we've been talking about several different topics over the last few weeks. And the guy that we've been focusing on a lot recently is the Old Testament prophet Jonah. And we've been discussing him at length, and Pastor Blake has been preaching through a sermon series here at Emmanuel last few Sundays. And today we're going to kind of continue that discussion and talk about a few more things. So just to review kind of our recent discussions about Jonah, and I encourage you, if you haven't watched any of the sermons from Pastor Blake, just go to our church's Facebook page. You can look in the video section and find all of our recent sermons. I encourage you to listen to that. They are a little shorter than usual. We've kind of condensed them down to make them a little more conducive for people in their living rooms that are not accustomed to having kids running around the room. So we encourage you to go back and listen to his sermon. This past week was very encouraging, very challenging. We're kind of the part in the narrative where Jonah has now been thrown overboard and is into the sea and is swallowed up by the great fish. So, Blake, why don't you give us a quick sermon summary of what we talked about this past week?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, we're now entering into the sea where Jonah is actually overboard. He's been thrown over, and it's interesting in chapter 1, verse 15, where the sailors, we see what the sailors do after the storm calms. You know, they go away, they find a place where they can make sacrifices, make vows, but we don't hear anything about what's going on in the water with Jonah. So there's a little bit of, we talked about this past Sunday about the fact that he's swimming, if he can swim, he's drowning, he's praying. We see that in the second chapter, is that he talks about in past tense what he was saying. I cried to the Lord, and then he goes through that narrative. And so we talked about what studies show as far as what goes on when someone is frantically trying to save themselves. They're still trying to stay afloat and so forth. What's going on physically, what's going on emotionally, and so forth. And we brought that into application of what people do today when they're trying to save themselves. And so that's the basic gist of application for us. Of course, we go into the comparisons of Jesus and so forth, but it was just, we spent time in the water, and then we spent time in the belly of a fish this past Sunday.
Yeah, all the drowning imagery was really interesting, especially when he mentions weeds wrapping around his head. Yeah. You think of seaweed, kelp, or whatever. That was really interesting. So we can't help but, now that we're in the water, we can't help but pause for a little bit and revisit the topic that those of you that listened to the very first episode about Jonah will remember. We kind of hit on the whole fish theories, and you can't really get away from this in our Western culture, sadly. People still want to argue and discuss about it. But we have these different fish theories, can a man be eaten by a fish or a whale? And can he survive in the belly of a fish or a whale for 3 days? Has other people done that in history? Is that documented? And there's just a lot of different things to think about. So, first of all, if you remember, we discussed at the very beginning that if you get lost in this discussion, you get lost in this argument, you're kind of losing the point of the book. The whole point. You're just overlooking what it's trying to teach. Just a reminder to everybody, it is an ancient book, so people didn't think the way we think. Right. It was very different culture, and it's a more Eastern book than it is a Western book. So they didn't write, the way Western, biographers would write the story of Jonah, or like a journalist. They weren't they weren't obsessed with details and with hardcore facts as much as they were truths that they were teaching. And so you can argue about if it's a fish or not a fish. Either way, if it didn't happen, if it's symbolic somehow, or something like that, it still doesn't undermine the narrative or the truth of what Jonah was teaching.
Right.
But, however, we do believe that, if God can create the universe from nothing and raise Jesus from the dead, I don't think it's a far cry that he could somehow allow a man to live in a fish for 3 days, or a whale.
So that's where we focused on that first week, not getting distracted, but staying on point with the story and answering those questions instead of did God do something? Can God do something?
Yeah, can he make him live in a whale?
Like I told you, that pastor that said if the Bible said that he got swallowed by a shrimp, he would believe that God could do that.
That was RC. Yes. Yeah, RC Sproul. If the Bible said he got ate by a shrimp, I believe it. Yeah. I like that. So anyway, what's funny is I did actually Google it just to let everybody know, and there are some different interesting myths down through the ages of people claiming to have been swallowed by whales or by fish.
The famous ones in the late
1800s. Yeah, and that one
was debunked.
Yeah, it was debunked as fake, and I think most of them are. We don't have a very clear documented record of a man surviving. They've all been told as kind of
not trying to offend anybody, but if you've heard some sermons where guys have used that, sorry, that was proven not to be factual.
Sadly, the research shows that wasn't real. But I do think it's completely possible, or even if it didn't happen exactly that way, that's not the point. It wasn't that type of a narrative. But I do think it was pretty cool that that guy invented the whole intricate story to try and prove that he was in a whale for 3 days. But anyway, so back to the whole idea of Jonah. So whether you believe in the fish story or not, and we do, it doesn't change what Jonah's teaching,
right?
And the point of the book. So the main point that you've been driving recently in the sermon series, and we've talked about a bunch of different things in Jonah, but we're kind of focusing right now on these deep comparisons between Jonah and Jesus,
right?
And those don't come out of nowhere. Like, we're not forcing a Christology on the text that isn't there, Jesus claimed this weird connection with Jonah. All these different references to Jonah in the New Testament. So the question is, why did Jesus see, Jonah's story as relevant, in his time? So let's discuss the comparison of Jonah and Jesus in this particular section of the story. He falls in the water and is eaten by the fish.
Absolutely. So Jonah goes into the water, is cast into the water, and so we talked about that last week. Is the picture of the sailors cast him over. He gave himself over, but he says in his prayer, he says, "You have cast me over." So it was the will of the Father. He's in the water, drowning, swimming, trying to stay afloat. We don't know exactly what's going on in his mind, except for what is in the prayer in chapter 2. And so Jonah is a picture of disobedience, whereas Christ was the perfect picture of obedience. Total submission to the will of Father. He said that, "I have come to do the will of my Father." Both of them are cast into the sea representing suffering, death, a penalty, a penalty. The fish comes, and the fish for Jonah, contrary to sermons says, and God punished because he didn't do God's will. God punished him and put him in the belly of a fish and made him think about it for 3 days. No, that was actually deliverance. He was thinking about it in the water.
Yeah, in all of ancient literature, the sea, especially biblical literature, the sea is always allegorical of like destruction and death.
Right.
And just consume. I mean, nothing was like the sea. You can't tame the sea.
Mm-hmm.
People die in the sea unexplainably all the time. Yeah. So being delivered from the sea was a huge thing, because if he'd have stayed in the sea, he'd have died.
Right. So he's delivered in spite of his disobedience, whereas Christ, being completely and perfectly obedient, is delivered unto death.
Yeah.
So the whale is a representation of, and Jesus used this, he said, just as Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days,
so
3 nights, so the Son of Man will be, in
the heart of the earth, buried,
and so,
in a grave.
So it was a picture of death for Christ. And so we see that the disobedient one here is given mercy, where Christ, being completely obedient, is given over to wrath.
Yeah.
The
So
wrath of God.
Jonah was disobedient, but God delivered him. Mm-hmm. Whereas Jesus was obedient, and God killed him.
Right.
So we don't like to say that God killed Jesus, by the way, but God says that later on. So sinful man killed Jesus. It's the perfect meeting ground between the actions of man and the sovereignty of God.
Mm-hmm.
It pleased God to deliver his son up to death in order to justify the sinner, right? Mm-hmm. So God orchestrated the death of his own son, himself, incarnate, and also, Jesus here is, giving. He's a perfectly obedient son, and yet is killed.
Yep.
And Jonah is a perfectly disobedient son to Yahweh, and is delivered. So it's just crazy contrast between the two.
Jonah, just like Jonah, Jesus felt forsaken, and he prayed as one who was forsaken.
Yeah, the prayers there are interesting.
Yeah,
because Jesus prays
that's right.
before it happens, and Jonah prays.
Right. And Jonah acknowledges, though, his guilt. I'm guilty. You're totally justified in what you're doing. A sign of in the moment of a repentive heart, mm-hmm. and so forth. But Jesus was not guilty.
Yeah.
And Jesus never said, I'm guilty.
Yeah.
He bore our guilt
mm-hmm.
while being completely innocent.
Yeah.
For us. So one says, and he says, and here I am, I'm forsaken, and I'm done. Jesus says, I'm forsaken, it is finished.
Yeah. That was awesome. Yeah, so that contrast of the prayers there, Jesus is praying, your wrath is coming, deliver this cup away from me. Mm-hmm. The cup was a representative of God's wrath. Don't make me drink this. But Jesus said, but not what I will, what you will. Mm-hmm. And he was completely innocent and still, was condemned on our behalf. And Jonah was the, exact opposite. And just as a flash forward for everybody as what's coming, Jonah's repentance isn't what you could call a true heart change repentance. Right. He's repentant because he's in the belly of a fish, but as if you know the rest of the story, even then, Jonah repented, but he repented and obeyed begrudgingly.
Yep.
Begrudgingly. Yeah, he wasn't happy about it. He was, I got to go to Nineveh now, and he, gave like a 7-word sermon or something like that, and then go sat on a hill and waited for God to, destroy everything.
I'll go to Nineveh because he might send something bigger next time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Jesus didn't have to, Jesus suffered the penalty of God's wrath, and prayed that the cup would be delivered from him, but still went anyways. Jesus was a missionary happily,
right?
Unlike Jonah. Jesus wasn't sad or upset or grumpy about the fact that he had to go save those that rejected him. But it was an awesome contrast between the story of Jonah and Jesus. So you gave towards the end of the sermon, you gave 2 applications for the listeners, and just give us a run through of those 2 real quick.
Well, one was for the unbeliever, one is for the believer. And simply put, is that for the unbeliever, those who are paying attention, that are listening, and that, are hearing, are feeling these seeds falling on, on their heart, and we're praying that it falls on good soil. We're praying that they will recognize that God can put you in seemingly hopeless situations, Now, we can stop there just for a moment, because a lot of times hopeless situations or seemingly hopeless situations can lead to a rebellious heart.
Yeah.
You can rebel against that. But on the front side, to recognize that God is not doing that because he wants to hurt you. He is doing that because of all those who believe there is a power, and it's the gospel. And he's doing that to grab your attention in order that you will recognize that you will have to be rescued if you're going to live. That's what Jonah came to in chapter 2. The only way he was going to live is if something miraculous took place. And for the believer, for the unbeliever today, we have to recognize
it's the same story.
It's the same story.
Yeah.
That the only way that we can be saved is if something miraculous takes place. There is nothing more miraculous. We talked about the fish. We've talked about creation. But nothing is more miraculous than whenever God resurrects a dead soul.
Yeah, that's right. Saves a sinner.
And so that's for the unbeliever. And for the believer, we just now we have to empathize here with Jonah, because every once in a while we need the reminder. We talked about how some of the themes that are in the book, religious pride being one of them. Why is Jonah in this situation? Because he thought himself to be worthy of mercy and grace, as opposed to
and the Ninevites
the Ninevites
worthy.
aren't.
Yeah.
Well, and that's really what he never said, I'm worthy of this, but that's what his actions drew that conclusion. He says, I'm not going to talk to them. They're not worthy of it. But if he has it, he's implying I am worthy for it.
Yeah.
So sometimes we need to recognize that God can put us back
in
seemingly hopeless situations.
In order to remind us and to cause us to remember that you live because you were rescued.
Right.
So the only reason we're believers is because God rescued us. Whoever shared the gospel with you, someone shared the gospel to them, and them all the way back, and that was God.
That was God rescuing.
Yeah, wherever you were born, the situation, I like to say he's the architect of your salvation. Mm-hmm. So he decided who your parents would be, where you would be born, and the exact circumstances and way your life would play out. And if you're a believer, it really is only by the grace of God.
Right.
And the grace of his gospel. It's not because of anything you've done. You're not this superior being to those, wicked sinners out there that just can't see the light. God showed you grace, and dark storms and, scary oceans that we're thrown into sometimes, and dark places, and, they can function as reminders of the fact that we're only here by the grace of God.
Yeah. And
Jonah didn't seem to learn that fully, but we trust that hopefully someday down the road.
It was real
Jonah
in the moment.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Because he's recognizing when he wakes up and he's in a fish, or he's in this circumstance, and he's recognizing, okay, I'd be at the bottom of the sea. There was no ships. There was no land. There was no strength left in me to be able to swim and swim and swim. This was the only way that I was going to be saved. Yeah. The only way I was going to live. And I was rescued by this. And we need to recognize that as believers. Is that, and when we start thinking ourselves, but what separates me a little bit from them is I did something.
Yeah.
No, you didn't do anything. Please do not turn your faith into a works today.
Yeah.
And that's where we look at it. You were hopeless. Your arms were tired. Your legs were tired. You're sinking to the bottom. The seaweed's all around your neck. You're looking up, and the surface, the idea of salvation is more mocking. That's where we're at. But God provided a means. God did that.
Yeah.
And without that, you're at the bottom of the sea.
That's right. What a humbling reminder. And when you see Jonah in this light, it takes away it takes away the distractions of the fish stories and different debates like that, because it is so rich. It's a rich book, and even to teach us the analogies in relation to salvation. And so I hope this has been encouraging to those of you that have been listening. I do encourage everybody to continue to tune in and listen to. You can listen to this show, of course, but also on Sunday mornings, go on our Facebook page and watch the sermon. Maybe if you can't watch it as it's live, watch it later on. It's been a great series. I would encourage you to check it out. And also, on a side note, read the book of Jonah.
Yeah.
We encourage you. It's a very short book. It's 4 chapters. Take some time, read the book of Jonah, and really, really think about it, and try and look for the analogies of Christ throughout the book, and try and maybe you can read ahead, and some of you probably already have, and so you know where we're headed with this thing. So we're excited about this continued discussion over the next few weeks. We hope you all at home are doing well. We love you, praying for you dearly. I miss you all so much. Hope you're staying safe during this COVID-19 era of our culture and history. But we're looking forward to brighter days on the horizon. And so we hope to encourage you all. Hope to see you again soon. And God bless.
Thank you for listening to the Emmanuel Church podcast. If you liked the show, be sure to share us with your friends. If you want to be notified when a new episode is available, be sure to subscribe. If you are listening on YouTube or Facebook, you can find our show on all major podcasting platforms like the Apple Store, Google Play, and Spotify. We trust that God, His Word, and the Gospel was magnified on today's show. And we hope that you will listen in next time for more content relevant to the Christian life. Until then, we say God bless and thank you for listening to the Emmanuel Church podcast.